In the early hours of Sunday the 3rd of September 1916, as Londoners slept peacefully in their beds, 16 German airships, the largest fleet ever assembled, laden with about 30 tons of bombs, was headed for Britain. At 2 AM, without warning, the sky of London exploded into action as shells burst and searchlights swept the heavens. Awoken by this storm of shot and shell, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, left their beds to peer skywards from windows, doorways and gardens. Previous Zeppelins over the capital had been viewed with apprehension. These vast airships, shining silver in the searchlights, with their droning engines, threatening the city with a brooding menace, had always appeared to be beyond reach and impervious to attack. But this time it was different, and one raider was now in trouble. In this video, using the latest technology, historic imagery and the testimony of those who were there, we'll follow the fortunes of Lieutenant William Leaf Robinson and airship SL-11. To fully understand the story, we need to go back to the beginning of the 20th century. In 1900, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin launched his first eponymous airship and, overcoming a number of potentially crushing failures, gained the support of the German people. His airships becoming an iconic source of national pride and the very embodiment of German technical superiority. In America, in 1903, 3 years after that first Zeppelin flight, the Wright brothers made the first recognised sustained powered flight by an aeroplane. That flight lasted only 12 seconds, but just 12 years later, aeroplanes and airships would meet in combat over Great Britain. But at a time when aeroplanes were just fragile constructions of wood, wire and linen, the great airships appeared to be the future of aviation. Before the outbreak of the First World War, Count Zeppelin's airships had carried thousands of civilians on pleasure flights, and the military began to take notice, with both the German army and navy acquiring them for reconnaissance roles. But there was also a possibility of carrying bombs, something beyond the ability of aeroplanes in 1914. For centuries, the Royal Navy had patrolled the seas around these islands, keeping Britain free from enemy attack. But the development of German airships meant the nation now lay vulnerable to assault from the air, a type of attack that Germany believed could crush the morale of the civilian population and force the government to seek peace. We've so far been talking about Zeppelin airships, however this story is not actually about a Zeppelin, but rather one built by a rival company, Schutte Lanz. So what's the difference? Outwardly, the two types look fairly similar, but it's inside, under the outer covering, that the main difference becomes clear. Whereas the rigid framework of a Zeppelin is built of an aluminium alloy called duralumin, that of a Schutte Lanz was constructed of plywood. But to those viewing these great airships from the ground, there seemed to be no difference, and to those in Britain, all German airships were simply known as Zeppelins, a name they came to hate and to curse, and to dub as baby killers. Although SL-11 was of the latest design, only commissioned the previous month, airships weren't without their problems, as the crews knew only too well. Let's take a closer look. SL-11's crew numbered 16, although crew sizes did vary. The majority of the men were mechanics with responsibility for the four 240 horsepower Maybach engines, but there were also those who steered the ship by controlling elevators and rudders, a wireless man and another who helped maintain the hydrogen bags in flight, as well as a commander and his executive officer, and all could be called on to man the 6 defensive machine guns when needed. Perhaps the worst posting was manning the machine guns positioned on the very top of the airship, where there was no protection from the elements other than a low canvas screen. And for everyone there was always the cold, with missions lasting as much as 24 hours and with temperatures often well below freezing. Not only were the conditions bad, but airships were extremely difficult to navigate. Weather forecasting was in its infancy, and Germany had no information regarding weather fronts approaching the British Isles. Airships could generally maintain a speed of around 50 miles per hour in favourable conditions, but if flying into headwinds, speed would be dramatically reduced, while crosswinds could force a raider far off the intended course. Unreliable engines meant breakdowns were common, and an effective blackout over Britain added to the difficulty in locating targets, because raids only took place during the darkest phase of the moon each month. In short, the experience of an airship crew raiding Britain could be testing in the extreme. The commander of SL-11, Wilhelm Schramm, was an early pioneer in the story of lighter-than-air flight, and he had a remarkable story. Let's find out more. Schramm was actually born in England in 1885 in Charlton, southeast London, where his father was a director of the German engineering firm Siemens. However, before Wilhelm was 5 years old, his father suffered a stroke, forcing the family to return to Germany. He joined the German army in 1905, but gripped by the wave of enthusiasm sweeping the country, in 1910 he transferred to the army's airship service. Schramm's first raid on England was in 1915 as executive officer on board another Schutte Lanz, SL-2. Incredibly, during that raid he came close to bombing his old home when the blast wave from a bomb smashed windows in 40 houses in the street where he was born. Subsequently, he led 2 other raids on Britain in 1916, but with little success. Zeppelin raids on Britain had commenced in January 1915. Earlier, in Europe, army Zeppelins flew low-level reconnaissance over the French army, whose rifles peppered their gas bags with hundreds of tiny holes. The resulting loss of the vital hydrogen lifting gas forcing 4 down in August 1914. But over Britain they flew at far greater altitudes, in the region of 2 miles high. An airship was an enormous target, approaching 200 yards long. How could it be difficult to find and destroy one? The answer is harder than it seems. In 1915, during 35 individual sorties, only 1 Zeppelin was damaged when raiding Britain, and that by anti-aircraft fire, coming down in the English Channel to be towed back to port by German warships. Britain's defending aircraft, mainly the BE-2C, had machine guns firing standard solid lead bullets. They could pierce the hydrogen bags, but they couldn't ignite the gas. Therefore, defending aircraft needed to get above the airship to drop bombs or explosive darts on it, but Zeppelins could easily outclimb the slow and cumbersome aircraft employed against them. And pilots had no radios, so once they were airborne they were blind, waiting for a searchlight to illuminate the target, and if found the Zeppelin could effortlessly climb away, leaving the pursuing aircraft struggling in its wake. Let's have a look at the science behind the problem. An airship is a huge target, as we've seen, and the immediate assumption is that a target this size, filled, in the case of SL-11, with 1.3 million cubic feet of highly flammable hydrogen, must be easy to destroy. But not so. The hydrogen within the airship's vast outer covering, the envelope, was contained in up to 19 separate airtight gas bags arranged along the length of the vessel. Hydrogen only becomes flammable when mixed with oxygen. A means was needed to force these 2 elements to combine before igniting the gas. Those standard lead bullets were not the answer, but help was at hand. Although experiments at the beginning of the war with incendiary bullets had come to nothing, 3 men were privately working on a solution, developing bullets that would ultimately solve the problem. In 1916, all 3 bullets underwent trials and were accepted into service, each bullet bearing the name of its inventor. The Pomeroy was an explosive bullet, the Buckingham incendiary, while the Brock offered elements of both. While no individual bullet appeared to guarantee success, it was felt that by firing the bullets from a machine gun in sequence, it was possible an explosive bullet could blow open a gas bag. With the escaping hydrogen now mixing with oxygen in the air, it was hoped that a following incendiary bullet would ignite the now volatile gas. The pilots of the Royal Flying Corps had great hopes for the new bullets and were eager for a chance to strike a blow against the Zeppelin menace. Let's meet one of those men. William Leaf Robinson, the son of a coffee planter, was born in India in 1895 and educated in India and England. He did well in his school's officer training corps and attended Sandhurst in 1914, from where he was posted as a second lieutenant to the Worcestershire Regiment, then based in Cornwall. But the boredom and drudgery of training recruits soon wore Robinson down, and he looked for a way to do his bit. In March 1915, he successfully applied for a transfer to the Royal Flying Corps, joining No. 4 Squadron in France, flying as an observer. Wounded in the arm in May, while convalescing back in England, he applied for pilot training. Having earned his wings and showing an aptitude for night flying, by February 1916 he was based at Sutton's Farm Airfield, home to No. 19 Reserve Aeroplane Squadron, soon to become No. 39 Home Defence Squadron. By the end of August, he had 2 unsuccessful close encounters with Zeppelins under his belt, but now, with his machine gun loaded with the new bullets, he shared a growing air of confidence with his fellow pilots. By September 1916, the Zeppelin menace was at its height, with many people suffering stress and fear, particularly in London, which had already been bombed 6 times. Let's hear one woman's experience of a raid. I crept cautiously upstairs and peeped with frightened eyes out of the open front door and up at the sky. I did not see the Zeppelin, but I saw the shrapnel bursting into flame in the sky, as if a star had suddenly exploded. It was very beautiful, but awful too. The sounds were so ghastly, and the knowledge that each thud of a bomb falling to earth carried death and destruction with it added to the horror of it all. This was, of course, exactly the effect that German High Command hoped for, and they anticipated more of the same when they launched their largest raid of the war on Britain on the night of the 2nd-3rd of September 1916. The target was England South, London if possible. The raid involved 16 airships and was one of the rare occasions when Army and Navy Zeppelins attacked in concert, with the Navy fielding 11 Zeppelins and a Schutte Lanz, and the Army sending one Schutte Lanz along with 3 Zeppelins. That Schutte Lanz was Wilhelm Schramm's SL-11. They ascended from bases all over Germany, with SL-11 departing from Spich between Cologne and Bonn. Takeoff times for the aerial armada varied between noon and 3:30 p.m. SL-11's route took her across Belgium before heading out over the North Sea, but she was not picked up by observers until approaching Foulness Island on the Essex coast at 10:40 p.m. From there, SL-11 pushed inland across Essex. 20 minutes after SL-11 appeared off the coast, warning of an air raid was received at headquarters of No. 39 Home Defence Squadron and immediately relayed to the flight commanders at the squadron's 3 airfields. Standing orders required a pilot of each flight to spiral up to 10,000 feet over their own airfield before following a set patrol line for 2 hours. Scanning the sky, they relied upon searchlights to pick a Zeppelin out of the darkness. At 11:10 p.m, Lieutenant William Leaf Robinson's BE-2C of B Flight rumbled across the grass airfield at Sutton's Farm near Hornchurch and disappeared into the night sky, flying a patrol from there to Joyce Green Airfield near Dartford. A minute later, a pilot from A Flight took off from North Weald Bassett to patrol to Hainault Farm Airfield, a few miles from Romford, followed by a C Flight pilot whose patrol searched between the airfields at Hainault Farm and Sutton's Farm. It would be 40 minutes before they climbed to a patrol height. By then, SL-11 was close to Saffron Walden in Essex, about 30 miles away to the north. Wilhelm Schramm continued unopposed as he flew a great arc to the north of London, not dropping his first bombs over Hertfordshire until 1:20 a.m. London was in sight. 10 bombs dropped, although it's unlikely he found a target. It was fairly common practice to drop a number of bombs to lighten the ship and gain height prior to the main attack. Those bombs fell around London Coney and South Mimms, but caused no damage. 8 minutes later, more bombs dropped when a searchlight tried to illuminate SL-11. They fell north of Potter's Bar between Little Heath and Northall. Schramm planned to fly a zigzag course and now changed heading to the south, with more bombs falling north of Enfield between Cuffley and Clay Hill, one causing a significant fire at Stud Farm, resulting in the death of 3 racehorses, with other bombs falling near Southgate. Twisting to the west, 2 bombs landed at Hadley Wood, dangerously close to a tunnel entrance of a main railway line to London. Then Schramm turned again, southeast towards the centre of London. The time was now 1:50 a.m. Let's return to William Leaf Robinson. At 1:50, Robinson was about 20 miles away and already overdue back at Sutton's Farm at the end of his patrol. He'd had a close encounter with the Zeppelin near Gravesend, but frustratingly lost it in the clouds. Now he was scanning the Black Essex countryside for the welcoming landing flares of Sutton's Farm when he spotted a red glow in the sky north of London. Although tired, frozen and stiff after his night's work, rather than taking the easy option and descending, he turned his BE-2C away from Sutton's Farm and headed towards the source of the light, the fire started by SL-11's bombs. SL-11 meanwhile was closing on London. Lieutenant Moffat, commanding an anti-aircraft gun in Finsbury Park, heard the approaching engines and caught a fleeting glimpse of the airship as it passed a gap in the clouds. Searchlights saw it too, and at 2 a.m. Moffat's guns blasted into action. Robinson headed towards the converging lights as other guns all over London burst into action, their great exploding shells being those that awoke London's population and brought them out onto the streets. For Schramm, the situation had suddenly deteriorated, and he shied away from central London as the guns continued to blast the sky as SL-11 desperately climbed away, hoping to find safety in the clouds. For those countless Londoners who'd left their beds, it was quite a show. They stood spellbound as the great drama unfolded, seeming to recognise that this powerful response was very different from anything that had gone before, and that they were witnesses to a momentous event. Many parents dragged still sleepy children from their beds to share the moment, all desperately willing the guns to find the target and for a raging inferno to illuminate the sky. Having turned away from central London, Schramm headed north towards Edmonton, breaking free from the searchlights and guns, which ceased firing at 2:13 am. But this respite was brief, as 2 minutes later others of the Waltham Abbey command area engaged as SO-11 drifted in and out of view through the mist and fog. Schramm began dropping bombs again over Edmonton, the first since Hadley Wood, with more at Ponder's End and others falling amongst the vast market gardens that featured widely in the landscapes towards Turkey Street and Bull's Cross. The commander of the Temple House gun had been observing the approach of SL-11 for 8 minutes before coming into action. The crew thought one round hit the rear of the airship, but the officer reported hearing machine gun fire. He had. Unseen in the darkness, 21-year-old William Leaf Robinson, at a height of almost 13,000 feet, was closing in. Let's hear his thoughts. Remembering my last failure, I sacrificed height for speed and made nose down in the direction of the Zeppelin. I saw shells bursting and night tracer shells flying around it. When I drew closer, I noticed that the anti-aircraft aim was too high or too low, also a good many some 800 feet behind. A few tracers went right over. Having overtaken SL-11, Robinson turned back and flew directly towards the airship, his tiny BE-2C dwarfed by the overpowering bulk of the great aerial monster. With his machine gun mounted so it could only fire upwards through a cutout in the upper wing, his best position for attack was from underneath, or if he attacked from the side, he needed to tilt his aircraft over alarmingly on its side. Robinson describes what happened next. Although those powerful moments were witnessed by thousands, they were not captured on film, though this powerful set of prints produced shortly afterwards demonstrate what many saw on that night. I flew about 800 feet below it from bow to stern and distributed one drum along it, alternate Brock and Pomeroy. It seemed to have no effect. I therefore moved to one side and gave it another drum distributed along its side, without apparent effect. I then got behind it. By this time I was very close, 500 feet or less below, and concentrated one drum on one part on the underneath rear. I was then at a height of 11,500 feet when attacking the Zeppelin. I had hardly finished the drum before I saw the part fired at glow. In a few seconds, the whole rear part was blazing. Above him, the now uncontrollable burning airship began to fall as Robinson squirmed out of its path. He described the moment in a letter to his parents. I hardly know how I felt as I watched the huge mass gradually turn on end and, as it seemed to me, slowly sink, one glowing, blazing mass. I gradually realised what I'd done and grew wild with excitement. Far below, a journalist watched the final moments of SL-11. We watched fascinated the terrible death of the Zeppelin. The blazing airship swung around for an instant, broadside on, as though unmanageable. Then the burning end dipped, the flames ran up the whole structure as her petrol tanks one after the other caught fire. In another second or two, the Zeppelin, now perpendicular, was falling headlong to earth from heights not much short of a couple of miles, a mass of roaring flame. With ever-increasing momentum, she sped down until at last she struck the earth with a crash that could be heard for miles. A dull red glow brightened the heavens for a few seconds, and a distant mass of still-burning wreckage was all that was left. SL-11 crashed on farmland at the village of Cuffley, Hertfordshire. Wilhelm Schramm and his crew all died. Their final moments were horrendous. Some went down with the burning airship, risking being burnt alive. Others chose to jump, hoping for a swifter end. One who did so was discovered in an upright position, with his femurs thrust through his body towards his collarbone. Another, who stayed on board, was discovered with his arms and legs burnt away from his body. The effect on the other Zeppelin commanders was instant. Those approaching London abandoned their missions and turned for home. The effect on the British population was enormous too. Those countless onlookers across London and surrounding counties had initially watched in silence, but when SL-11 fell from the sky, the cheers grew, reaching a crescendo as she smashed into the ground. A brief pause and then realisation set in. After 25 months of war, one of the feared and hated baby killers had been destroyed before their eyes. This was a moment in history, witnessed by the masses. And at a stroke, the British public no longer felt defenceless in the face of the Zeppelin menace. Cuffley instantly became a place of pilgrimage, and thousands made their way there within hours of the crash by all modes of transport. Robinson and a group of fellow officers went too, but when identified as the hero, he was mobbed and had to retreat. He returned later in the day wearing civilian clothes. Even so, he was spotted by a friend, but he begged her not to give him away, telling her, "I've already had one dose of popularity this morning, and it very nearly killed me." But where exactly was the crash site that he visited? Let's take a look. A number of images from that time exist, showing the wreckage, but in reality there was little to see. As a wooden framed Schutte Lanz, the fire destroyed most of the structure, leaving the engines and a tangled mass of bracing wire. But within those images there is a crucial clue. In one, showing men with a huge roll of this wire, there is a building in the background, the corrugated iron St Andrew's Church. Although no longer there, it features on contemporary maps and confirms SO11 came down in an area covered by the modern housing between the Ridgeway and Cranfield Crescent. For the crew of SL11, there was little to remember them by, and the airship was wiped from the history books for many years. It was clear from the lack of metal at the crash site that the victim was a Schutte Lanz, yet few of the population had ever heard the name. Fearing this would lessen the huge impact Robinson's success had had on public morale, the authorities chose to announce the destroyed airship was another of that night's raiders. It was as the crew of Zeppelin L-21 that the men were laid to rest in a cemetery in Potters Bar, Hertfordshire. Robinson's destruction of SL-11 marked the beginning of the end for the Zeppelin threat. The bullets that had proved so successful brought down 2 more Zeppelins within a month and another 2 in November. The Zeppelin threat, however, had not entirely disappeared. Whereas there had been 42 Zeppelin nights across 1915 and 16, there were only 9 more over the last 2 years of the war. But the aerial threat to Britain hadn't gone away. In May 1917, the German army launched a new threat to London and southeast England, the long-range Gotha bomber. But that's a story for another day. If you do want to know more about the war in the air, be sure to check out our World War I podcast, Not So Quiet on the Western Front, where we recently took a deep dive into the story of Zeppelins in the first Blitz during the First World War. Those Zeppelin raids claimed the lives of 557 people and left 1,358 more bearing terrible injuries. These figures are dwarfed by the enormity of the Blitz of the Second World War, but to a nation that had no concept of attack from the air prior to 1914, it was a truly shocking experience. But for Robinson, his life now changed forever. At a time when newspapers were filled with the gloom of endless casualty lists from the Battle of the Somme, he was a good news story, and Robinson became an instant media celebrity. Just a few days later, he received a summons to Windsor Castle to be awarded the Victoria Cross from the hands of the King, the only VC awarded for an action in Britain. His perceived value to the country's morale saw Robinson withdrawn from active service and on a round of endless official engagements. He yearned to return to duty and eventually got his way with a posting to a new squadron, number 48. The squadron made its first operational flight in France on the 5th of April 1917, with Robinson leading a flight of 6 Bristol flighters, but it did not end well. Attacked by Manfred von Richthofen's Jagdstaffel 11, Robinson's flight lost 4 aircraft and he made a forced landing behind enemy lines, remaining a POW for the rest of the war. He proved a determined but unsuccessful escapee, but with his name known in Germany as the man who had shot down SL-11, he was singled out for harsh treatment. After the war, he returned to England in December 1918, a much weakened man, and just 17 days later, on the 31st of December, he succumbed to the influenza pandemic ravaging the globe. Thousands attended his funeral, and he was laid to rest in the cemetery of All Saints Church in Harrow Weald. The protagonists of this desperate battle, high above the English countryside, were all gone. In 1967, a new German cemetery opened at Cannock Chase in Staffordshire. The bodies of German and Austrian servicemen who had died during both World Wars were brought here from their original places of burial and reinterred. The crew of SL-11 now lie side by side with those of Zeppelin L-31, 32 and 48 in a beautifully maintained enclosed plot. Robinson was not forgotten either. Enthused by his achievement, the readers of the Daily Express newspaper raised money for a memorial commemorating his heroic deed. The memorial was erected by the side of the road just yards from where SL-11 fell, but sadly he never saw it. By the time it was unveiled in June 1921, Robinson was dead. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to support us to make more content just like this, please take a moment to check out our Patreon and YouTube membership links below. For those wanting to know more about the German air raids on Britain during the First World War, we highly recommend Ian Castle's Forgotten Blitz trilogy, with Zeppelin Inferno covering the raids of 1916 in great detail. Finally, also a huge thank you to Ian, whose help and expertise has been invaluable in retelling this story. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.